Hello, everyone. In this podcast, we will be discussing sensitive topics such as sexual assault. It's important to take care of yourself while listening. Some suggestions are listening while you're in a healthy headspace or knowing who you can reach out to if you become upset. Our 24/7 helpline for crisis calls based out of Central Florida is 407-500-HEAL. By contacting the national hotline at 1-800-656-4673, you can get support and learn about your local resources. There's always someone ready to help. Welcome to the Victim Service Center podcast. Here we sit down with professionals that serve survivors and victims of trauma or those who've experienced violence and have conversations about social issues. My name is Emilie Mitchell, my pronouns are she, her, and I'm the Education Coordinator at the Victim Service Center of Central Florida. Today we have a rather special episode. Back in April, which is Sexual Assault Awareness Month, we held a live Zoom panel with 4 amazing panelists to talk about preventing sexual assault on campus. And we were able to record that, and that is what we're going to be sharing this week for this week's episode. With that, I'm going to go ahead and introduce the panelists and have a little introduction, and then I'll go ahead and share the recording with you all. So with that, the first panelist I will introduce today is Sarah Laake. So Sarah uses she, her pronouns and is the director of the Title IX office of Rollins College. Sarah has 15 years of experience working in the nonprofit and higher education sectors as an advocate creating environments free from violence and discrimination. She has served as director of Title IX at Rollins College since 2018, overseeing Title IX compliance for the institution, managing grievance processes, providing care and support for involved parties, and leading violence prevention education initiatives. She previously worked at the University of Central Florida for 6 years, where she provided leadership in victim services, student Title IX investigations, trauma-informed care, supportive measures, and prevention education programming. Additionally, she has significant experience as a 24-hour domestic violence hotline manager and rape crisis victim advocate. She is passionate about upholding fair and equitable practices on campus and preventing sexual and interpersonal violence through education. Our next panelist is Julia O'Connor. Julia uses she, her pronouns and is an assistant professor at the University of Central Florida, or UCF, in the School of Social Work. She is also a member of the Violence Against Women faculty cluster and has a secondary appointment in the Department of Population Health Services. Julia's practice experience includes many years as a domestic and sexual violence advocate. Her research interests include violence against women, focused on primary prevention of violence, those who perpetuate violence, and marginalized populations. Next, we have Jessica Baker. Jessica uses she, her pronouns and is a victim advocate at UCF Victim Services since 2018. Prior to her current role, Jessica was a victim advocate at the State Attorney's Office in the 9th Judicial Circuit, working in the Domestic Violence Unit's Felony Division. She believes survivors and values a survivor's right to choose the path they walk after any trauma, abuse, or victimization. And our final panelist is Kevin Fox. Kevin uses he, him pronouns and is a victim advocate in an adjunct position at the VSC and Zebra Coalition, serving survivors in the LGBTQ+ community. Kevin worked as a high school teacher while receiving his Master of Arts in Clinical Mental Health Counseling from Rollins College. His passion when working with clients is to help them increase their resilience and satisfaction with their everyday lives. He seeks to help clients increase their meaning from life and live more authentically and honestly. So as a brief introduction, according to the National Sexual Violence Resource Center, approximately 1 in 5 women and 1 in 16 men will be sexually assaulted while attending college. Though these statistics are staggering, I always like to mention that these are just reported numbers, or simply what we know. Research tells us that 90% of survivors of sexual assault on campus do not report, and according to RAIN, which is the Rape, Abuse, Incest National Network, only 20% of female student victims aged 18 to 24 report to law enforcement. The ages of 18 to 24 are actually the highest risk years for sexual violence, which is the average age range for adults attending college. Sexual violence is one of the most underreported crimes, and despite it being so prevalent on campuses, female identifying student survivors are even less likely to report than non-students within their age group. Given its overwhelming prevalence, it's incredibly important to bring awareness to the topic of sexual assault on campus and how we all can contribute to its prevention in an effort to support survivors in their healing and ultimately end violence. So with that, I'm going to go ahead and let you enjoy the panel. Thank you so much. Good afternoon, everyone. I'm really excited to have this conversation, and I just want to thank all of our panelists for being here today. Just a real quick introduction. My name's Emilie Mitchell. I am the education coordinator at the Victim Service Center of Central Florida, and I'm really excited to have this conversation about how we can prevent sexual violence on college campuses. I know that we are already kind of sharing all these different statistics. This is a huge, huge issue, and it's such an important conversation to have, especially during Sexual Assault Awareness Month, which is continuing through the month of April. With that, I think that it's really important to start off this panel a little bit about rape culture. So I was wondering if first I can ask you, Sarah, if you could actually, in your own words, how you would define rape culture, and if there are some specific examples of rape culture found on college campuses.
Sure. Thanks, Emilie. Good to see you. Emilie and I work a lot together here at Rollins, so it's practically like she's part of our office. So always happy to see you. I think this is a great question to start off with. And I think I define rape culture as a culture in which our societal responses to rape and sexual violence excuse or even tolerate these types of abuse. In rape culture, sexual harassment and sexual violence might be ignored or normalized through everyday language that minimizes the issues, how the issues are presented in popular media, making jokes or making light about the subjects. Victim blaming rather than focusing on the actions of the perpetrator is another contributing factor to rape culture. And I think we see this on college campuses in many ways, but some that initially come to mind are thinking that catcalling is okay and not a form of sexual harassment, or the tendency of some people to think colleges and universities are ruining the future of an accused student by upholding a Title IX or student conduct process. We see it also at the large-scale cover-ups of harassment and abuse that have occurred at such schools as Penn State, Michigan State, more recently LSU, and many others. And we also might see examples in Greek life or athletics where hazing becomes sexual in nature and a part of that culture, or even a hyper-masculine expectation for our male students might lead to a culture where they demean women or joke about sexual violence. I feel like I could go on and on about this, but those are some things that initially come to mind.
Thank you so much, Sarah. Yeah, I think it's super important that we talk about these specific examples, and having that definition is super helpful. We all know that, rape culture is that thing that perpetuates and props up things like sexual violence. And we, have all the power in the world to also break those things down too. But first we kind of need to define it. So I appreciate that, Sarah. Julia, in my trainings, I reference that learning the meaning of consent is one of those things that we can do to combat rape culture. So with that, what is the best way to teach consent on college campuses? And is there anything we should be doing better when it comes to hosting conversations about consent?
That's a great question. I think that, well, first of all, I think that we have definitely improved in this area, right? That we used to think of consent kind of as just saying no, that we didn't even necessarily think about what actual consenting to sexual behavior was. So now we've kind of expanded our idea of consent in terms of yes means yes, but also that we should have consent for various different activities, that there's not like a global consent, that sexual behavior involves many different activities and that they should all be consented to. And I think even more than that, we've really expanded the definition of consent in terms of understanding that it must be voluntary, right? So that we can't have coerced consent isn't actual consent. It has to be voluntary consent, mutual, so that both parties are agreeing to the behavior. Unambiguous, sometimes there's talk of like a gray area, but the consent should be unambiguous, clearly understood by both parties. My favorite element that I think that we really need to be teaching students is enthusiastic, right? That we can live in a society that's enthusiastic about sexual behavior. It's part of our normal behavior, and that consent and should be enthusiastic, should be excited about participating in these types of behaviors. It should be coherent and informed, taking into account things like alcohol and drug use. Reversible, meaning that you can change your mind, and that's totally fine. And also ongoing and specific. Like I kind of mentioned before, that consent isn't a one-time deal, that it's a process that you're always kind of revisiting, right? So I think really understanding this expanded definition of consent, right? And teaching students examples of what that looks like and what it doesn't look like. Also talking about verbal and non-verbal cues, and allowing students to practice these skills. So these aren't necessarily skills that people just know automatically. We're not taught at any point growing up, usually, how to consent to behaviors, and it's not an innate knowledge that we have. So it's something that we have to teach them. This is a tool in their toolbox, right? And that we have to provide them the tools. And then we also have to allow them, as silly as it might be or might sound, to maybe practice. So role playing, or and I'm not saying role playing sex, I'm saying role playing like how do you say yes to something? How do you say no to something? And finally, I think, it's really important that we talk to students about consent in a more descriptive way, in this kind of expanded way that I've talked about. But also we have to really understand that consent is only one piece of the puzzle, right? That we know that consent-seeking behaviors, so asking for consent, is related to other factors, such as somebody's ability to assert themselves in terms of communication. Also, consent-seeking behaviors are less likely to occur among those individuals who endorse rape myths or have certain other attitudes and beliefs that are related to sexual assault perpetration. So it's not just enough to teach consent. It has to be wrapped into a comprehensive package.
That makes a lot of sense, because I love that what you said, that it's just a piece to the puzzle of like the big kind of rape culture that we're living in. And it's a big system. And so all these things are kind of, I didn't know about like those correlations and things like that, but it makes sense. And so if we kind of attack at one piece, we kind of have to break down the entire system, right, in order to make that change. I also like that you brought up verbal and nonverbal consent too. I think a lot of times we don't talk about nonverbal consent. Do you have some examples of like things like nonverbal consent in case people are wondering?
I was trying to think of like an example with getting too explicit. So actually think about during COVID and what it's been like talking to people wearing a mask, right? For me, I have found it, I'm teaching in a classroom, and my students are all masked when I'm teaching. And I have found it very difficult to understand my students' emotions because of the mask. So think about what they might say something, but sometimes I'm not even sure if they're understanding something because I'm not seeing the expression. So I think it is very different for somebody to articulate a yes and then articulate a yes with their nonverbal, right? That it's very different to say yes or yes. We see that sometimes people are articulating things perhaps because they feel that they should be going along something, but they're not necessarily that into it. It's not the enthusiastic yes we want. So it might be this kind of, well, I guess. And if you look at the body language, you're able to see that, okay, that person actually isn't that into it.
Yeah, I think that that's super important to bring up. So thank you so much, Julia. I love that you also said that like consent is like, often and consistent, and also kind of this conversation that we're having. So I love that. Jessica, one of the things, kind of just shifting gears a little bit, people may say to a victim of sexual assaults after they share their story is, oh, you just regretted sex, you weren't raped. As the victim advocate at Victim Services at UCF, is this something you have heard as a reaction to a survivor on campus? And how would you address this? And what would you say to a survivor who may be questioning their experience on whether or not they were sexually assaulted after hearing something like this?
Yeah, this is a great question. I have heard this as a response with my work here. I've had clients share statements that they've received when disclosing to friends, family, partners, and more commonly a statement like this when they confront the perpetrator. So I think to address the statement, it's saying, oh, you just regretted the sex, you weren't raped. This is telling someone how they feel, and it's classifying what has happened to them as not real. So for the person that's responding to a disclosure with this statement, it's not really within your power to decide how a survivor feels or classify what their experience has been. I see it as very dismissive, demeaning, and hurtful. And it's just perpetuating this culture that we've kind of touched on already in this panel of rape culture and victim blaming in our community. So when a survivor comes to us in the aftermath and is questioning, they've disclosed to someone that's given them this type of response. It's when we think of someone that discloses, it's going to be a family member, a friend, a partner, someone that we trust, because this is something that we want support in if we come forward. So we're going to go to somebody we trust. So when they come to us having this situation, they're really trying to make sense of what has happened. They've had doubt instilled in them because of this person that their opinion weighs in how they perceive it. So for our job here at Victim Services, we really want to give them a safe place to talk about their feelings because it's their truth, what has happened to them. No one can take that from them. So we really use validating their feelings, and using the statement, trust your gut, is really common. You know when something is wrong, when you're uncomfortable, when a boundary has been crossed. So it's really just giving them that place without judgment, to allowing them to realize what has happened to them, because they know. It's just needing that support and validation, and then supporting them in whatever path they want to walk after they come to that realization.
Thank you so much. Yeah, I think that those are all super important tips. I always like to mention that you might be the first person that this person is reaching out to, and that can make a whole difference for their healing journey. I think they're actually more likely to reach out to services sooner if the person that they first disclosed to is that supportive person that is able to validate. And so being an awesome supporter, and throughout, Sexual Assault Awareness Month, I've been doing a lot of podcasts with survivors, and a lot of times I hear them say, I ask them, what helped you on your healing journey? And a lot of them always say, oh, it was my support system. And so that really is super critical for a survivor And so I love kind of talking about how we can be better supporters, because I truly think that that is definitely kind of a piece to rape culture is, that those victim blaming statements, not believing survivors. And so that's definitely a way we can kind of reverse that too. And another piece of rape culture are rape myths or assumptions about rape that we as a society hold to be true, but are actually false. So Kevin, one of those rape myths is that men cannot be victims of sexual assault, when in fact we know that 1 out of every 10 rape victims actually identifies as male. So how does this affect male survivors on whether or not they will come forward? And with that, what can colleges be doing better for male survivors?
Yeah, this one's hard, and I think there's so many different angles to it, as far as all of those systemic barriers that keep male survivors from feeling like there is support for them. Everything from, I think the classic thing that comes to mind, which is that masculine persona that a lot of males carry, where oh, I should have been tough enough, or I should have been fit enough or strong enough or fast enough to get away from the situation, as opposed to, being a victim. Traditionally, men are not supposed to be victims. They're supposed to be the knights in shining armor that come and prevent these things from happening. While ironically, they're also the ones perpetuating these things. So I think it's a tricky situation, especially when you get into the intersectionalities of the LGBTQ community as to why they don't feel comfortable going to support. I think the programming for men is still being worked out. Even looking in this Zoom meeting, and obviously I'm grateful that everyone's here and taking something away. And I just have blank screens with names, but if I had to guess, there's only maybe 3 males here. So it's what can we do to get more males involved in being a part of this talk? On that college campus setting, is it when you're going to rush a fraternity, you have to be a part of something like this? How could we ensure that happens? Is this part of just a 101 class? I know orientations at FSU and UF and UCF usually talk about sexual assault to some capacity. But how do we keep that going throughout a student's tenure at their university to continue to have that conversation and raise that awareness?
I love that. I know that we've been kind of talking about different violence prevention education, and one of the strategies is mobilizing men. And yeah, I think that's a lot of what you were kind of alluding to. I also want to let the panelists know if at any point you want to just jump in, you can, so if Kevin said something or Julie said something and Sarah, you want to jump in, please do so at any time. But going off of that, Sarah, and it is great to see you. I feel we always are seeing each other. It's I almost work at Rollins too, which I love. Reporting or seeking help after sexual assaults can be stigmatized or extra challenging in certain cultures, and lead to, for example, BIPOC survivors not getting that help. So what can some of those specific barriers look like? Kevin was kind of alluding to male survivor barriers. And then how can college campuses help make seeking help safe for BIPOC survivors to seek services?
This is another tough but really important question. And I think underscores the very real intersectionalities of racism and gender-based violence when we think about sexual violence disproportionately impacting women of color. I think some of that stems from unfair stereotypes that have over history depicted women of color as hypersexualized or the subjects of fetishism. Things like that can contribute to some of these issues. And there can be much fear associated with reporting, as Jess was talking about earlier, including not being believed, being ostracized by your own community if you report and disclose that something has happened. I think a big one is lack of institutional trust. If you have a fear of institutions, if you have a fear of going to the police, if you have a fear that these institutions that are designed to protect people will not protect people who look like you, you're going to be far less likely to report. I know some people in different groups that have are traditionally marginalized populations don't want to call negative attention to that group that they belong to when there's already so much that they are struggling against. The very real risk of re-traumatization when you reach out to someone or disclose to someone who does not believe you, or almost the feeling of being treated as a suspect if you do report to law enforcement and don't receive care and support and compassion when you make that disclosure and make that report. So I think there's a lot that goes into people of color and survivors of color not seeking help. And it's a reality for many students who are in these traditionally marginalized groups who don't trust our institutions to protect them. And I think, thinking about Rollins, it's underscored even more for students of color at a predominantly white institution. If these students don't feel like they have a trusted resource on campus, they may not ever disclose experiencing sexual violence, and then not be able to seek the resources and reporting options and accommodations that are available to them. I think there are a number of things we can do and a lot of things we can do better. Offering a variety of support resources on campus, both confidential and non-confidential options, are extremely important in an attempt to reach as many student populations as we can. And doing specific outreach and education to different student groups based on affinity or cultures, I think is very important. Inviting these different groups into the conversation, as well as their trusted advisors in places we know that they seek support on campus. And we as administrators and educators need to become more informed allies. And if we're not conducting focused advocacy, education, outreach to our students of color and meeting them where they are going to be even less likely to trust us and come forward. I also think, when we think about the programming that we offer through our office, we are trying to offer education presented from a diverse group of presenters, and then in a variety of different formats to try to help reach more students. And then also making sure that information we present is culturally relevant to specific groups and different student populations. And I think that can really make a difference if we're using inclusive examples and making sure to note different cultural nuances that might be important in different groups. One thing that I've been learning more about recently is restorative justice also. And I think there's some evidence that offering these alternative paths to justice might be more appealing to students from different cultural backgrounds. So I think that's a promising practice that maybe will encourage more survivors to report if there's a restorative option rather than a more punitive option that they might be afraid of reporting their abuser. But those are just a few things on a really challenging and important topic that we've been talking a lot about this year and are constantly trying to learn and grow and do better.
I really appreciate everything that you just said, Sarah. I think that intersectionality is always a really important topic to bring up. And I can see exactly what you mean about the distrust of institutions, and that restorative justice is super important. Healing is different for everyone. And, it's not going through law enforcement. It might not always be the path that people want to take, and that's okay. So I appreciate that. Julia, I actually have recently come across a term called the red zone, which is in reference to sexual assault on campus. So research actually shows that the red zone is the time spanning the start of the fall semester through Thanksgiving break, when more than actually 50%, so more than half of all college sexual assaults are statistically found to occur. So given what we know about rape and vulnerable populations, what do you think, why do you think this phenomenon is occurring?
That's a great question. So I think that of course, it's complex. There's not one factor, right, that is driving up incidents of sexual violence during this time period, but it's kind of a confluence of different factors. But if we think about when the semester first starts at college, right, this is the time when Greek organizations usually hold rush events for students interested in fraternities and sororities. During which time we know during those events there's a lot of alcohol use. There's also often other types of similar activities with sports teams or other clubs on campus. So it's kind of a time of increased partying, getting together, people having increased contact with each other, drinking. There's also, it's a new school year, so people don't know each other in the same way that they do later in the semester. And especially freshmen are maybe particularly vulnerable because they don't have like a cohesive network of supports or friends to look out for them. They're unfamiliar with the campus. They're unfamiliar with resources. They're in a new setting, often away from home for the first time. They may be using alcohol at an increased rate, maybe to cope with anxiety or as a way of fitting in. It's an exploring alcohol and use, as well as sexual behavior that maybe they haven't before. They also maybe have less experience using alcohol, and so aren't necessarily aware of how much alcohol can be consumed. So all of that is to say that there's a lot of things going on that creates a population that may be easier to target for people who are perpetrators, as well as a lot of alcohol use, which we know is related to both perpetration and victimization of campus sexual assault. So I think those are some of the causes. And I think, thinking about prevention, which I always want to put on my prevention hat and think about how do we prevent this? And one thing that's particularly helpful to think about are these bystander interventions that we're learning about on most campuses, where, if you see something, say something, or intervene in some way if you can't say something. So we know that a lot of sexual assaults that involve alcohol actually occur in part when there are bystanders. So it might be before the assault or during the assault, there may be bystanders who can intervene. So really training students on how to intervene, but also how to recognize situations that are going on, because research also shows us that if you are using alcohol, you are more likely to see situations that could lead to sexual assault and need intervention, but you might be less likely to recognize those if you're using alcohol. So teaching students not only how to intervene when they see these situations, but also how to recognize these situations and then intervene, that it's a multi-step process that we have to be really training students on.
Which kind of goes back to like our first conversation about like consent. So like needing to understand consent is that one piece, and then kind of bringing in the active bystander. That's such a good point too, where I think a lot of sexual assaults on campus do involve alcohol consumption to some degree. And so the fact that we know that, and also that kind of the fact that it involves a lot of bystanders around there too, it's just like, wow, that can make such a huge difference. Just teaching active bystander awareness and things like that. So that's awesome. So Jessica, like mentioned in the introduction earlier, only 20% of female student victims ages between 18 to 24 report to law enforcement, while 32% of non-student females the same age do make a report. So that's non-student females compared to college females. So why do you think college students are less likely to report, and how are colleges possibly adding to this culture of silence?
So from my experience, clients are more likely to report to Title IX, to have the university investigate the incident rather than involving our law enforcement officers. I've heard statements from clients such as criminal charges are life-changing. We know that these perpetrators are friends, family, partners, past partners, and specifically with students, we have our social circles very enmeshed within college, within the campus. So Title IX can be really appealing for them because their main focus may be their education and how they can feel safe at school. I've heard, I just don't want them on campus. I want to feel safe and get my degree. So having the choice when we go over these reporting options, you can do both Title IX and make a police report. You can move forward with just Title IX. It's really up to the client at that point. We do see them moving towards Title IX more often, where they would like UCF to address it as far as a misconduct issue rather than having the investigation with law enforcement. And also said earlier, it's very intimidating for a student to make a report to law enforcement. We hear those similar statements of what if they don't believe me? What if they don't take it seriously? Also a lot of concern about who's going to find out. Will my parents know? So as far as how the colleges contribute to the culture of silence, I think it's needing to address the stigma that we see around reporting to law enforcement, specifically with this age group. Like you said, there's a difference when it comes to students versus non-students when coming forward. So for example, here at UCF, we have advocates within the police department here. Not a lot of law enforcement agencies have that. We also have a soft room. So when survivors do come forward, they are interviewed in a room that's been catered to make it more of a pleasant experience than in a normal interview room. Our law enforcement agency also has an emotional support dog that they will utilize. On the door in the soft room, they have a Start by Believing sign. So oftentimes after we are with a client that makes that report to the police here, they're surprised at the interaction, it being not as bad as they expected. So there's this expectation that it's going to be worse than it actually ends up being, because when they move forward with the process, they see all of these steps that the department and the officers do to support them through it. On the other hand, our work's never really done. We have all of these nice things that we can say, but at the same time, we're still hearing clients say, I'm scared to report. So I think we need to continuously police ourselves and how we're conducting our investigations, how we're treating those clients, because we're really serving the community. So when we do see issues that come, we need to address it and adapt to better serve them. So I think that there needs to always be an eye for how we can improve our process, because even where we are, it's still a very difficult process for a survivor to go through.
Definitely. I appreciate you bringing up all those different points, and it's nice to know about the advocates over at the UCF Police Department. And I do appreciate you saying, like, at the same time, there's still like changes that need to be made. I always like to say, like, this isn't a sprint, this is a marathon. So there's a lot of different pieces to it where, not to discourage, but more of like change can be, non-linear as well. And takes time as well. And there's little steps that we can take. Kevin, according to RAIN, college students who identify as trans actually experience higher rates of sexual violence. In fact, 21% of TGQN, or transgender, genderqueer, nonconforming college students have been sexually assaulted, compared to 18% of non-TGQN females and 4% of non-TGQN males. So what does it mean to be at risk? And why do you think this phenomenon is happening? How can colleges and universities support trans students? And is there anything they are lacking as far as resources, or is there anything they could be doing better?
Yeah. For the first part of that, to be at risk just means that you in some way belong to a population that just statistically is more likely to experience sexual assault for whatever reason, whether it's race, SES, gender, and in this case, trans or non-binary gender identities, which is, of course, another part of like the big LGBTQ umbrella. For this community specifically, as far as like the level of risk and why we do see an increase, it's tough to say. I think it goes back to some of the answers that we've heard with some of the other questions, where traditionally in society, they don't get support when they go and ask for help. And so it's created just the cycle of, one of my other trans friends tried to seek help for this and they were blamed, or they were misgendered, or they were, asked, well, are you a part of sex work? Or are you sure you weren't looking for it because you were out and you were drinking? And the victim blaming increases, like having an identity with a marginalized community leads more openings for victim blaming to occur, especially because maybe not so much now. I think definitely more than like the non-gay community, but you'll see a lot of trans people who, especially if they've been turned away from families, have to resort to sex work to sustain themselves. And obviously when someone wants to engage in sex work, that is totally fine. And that is their choice and their autonomy over their body. But it's also not necessarily safe depending on how it's done. And when you have an 18-year-old, a 19-year-old who's been turned away from their family, and that's the quickest way that they can make money, then they are, of course, more at risk. And I've seen in my time at Victim Service Center, working with law enforcement officers that support the idea of like, oh, well, they were walking on the street, or they were looking for sex for money, so this was bound to happen. And that just compounds all of those reasons on top of like the fear of being misgendered, fear of being ridiculed, fear of not being supported. As far as colleges and universities, most colleges and universities have those resources for the LGBTQ community. And most people know that. I don't know what the next step is to make people feel more comfortable using them if they aren't already. Sometimes I think, and I don't know like the intricacies of being a public school and receiving public funds, but like when we see things like the bills that are popping up everywhere that are preventing trans identified people from playing in the sport of the gender of their identity, our colleges coming out and saying like, well, at UCF or at FSU or at UF, anyone who identifies as male can be a part of the male basketball team. Like, are we seeing that translation so that trans students know like, okay, if I wanted to try out for this, I am supported and I'm not going to be made fun of. And that's one example. Most colleges now I've seen have like gender neutral restrooms, which it's just those small things that send the signal like, okay, someone here, some administrator is looking out for us. And so all of those small things can build that sense of safety. And then when things happen on campus that are anti-trans or anti-gender queer, taking that quick divisive action to say like, this is not who we are, this is not, what we believe in, and we have these resources available for those members of the trans and gender queer community.
I think those are all really good points, and it makes sense that, when we talk about survivors of sexual violence, one of the worst things that we could do is just re-victimize them. And I think that misgendering, things like that, are specific ways that re-victimization can absolutely occur. I know that we prepared a lot of different questions, and I'm looking at the time, and I do want to make sure that we have time for Q&A, because it looks like we also already have some questions coming in. So with that, I kind of wanted to, I might be jumping around a little bit, so I apologize. First off, I did want to ask, Sarah, specifically when college female students between the ages of 18 to 24 were asked in a survey on why they chose not to report the sexual assault to law enforcement. 10% cited that they did not want the perpetrator to get in trouble. And this is kind of something that Jessica was talking about. So through your work at the Title IX office, have you heard something similar? Do you find that there are certain stigmas surrounding Title IX itself and how it can help students and staff? And what are some of the options available to survivors through the Office of Title IX that go beyond a trial for student misconduct?
Yeah, it's a great question. And Jess touched on this, and I have had similar experiences that I've heard many times from survivors, that they don't want the perpetrator to get in trouble, or they don't want to ruin their life, or they don't want to get them kicked out of school. But what they do want them to know is that they harmed that person, and they want to prevent the same thing from happening to someone else. And they want the perpetrator to learn that what they did to them was wrong. So I think that is something that is common when college students are thinking about whether or not to report, and then how they want their case to play out if they do decide to report. Thinking about Title IX specifically, I think there's a common misconception that someone who reports to the Office of Title IX would be forced to go through an investigation or adjudication process, even if they didn't want to. And this is really not the case at all. In a small number of cases, an institution might need to move forward with an investigation, even if the complainant or the survivor didn't want to participate. That's usually in issues where we have a perpetrator who we know is a repeat offender for similar offenses and might need to do something about it, or if it's a particularly violent case involving a weapon or multiple perpetrators, we might feel the need for campus safety to move forward with the case. Even if that happens, the survivor would not have to participate if they didn't want to. I would say the majority of my work with survivors on campus involves presenting options, offering accommodations and support, connecting them to resources on campus in the community, and a very small number actually move forward to an informal or formal investigation process. And I think it's important for students to know that when someone is referred to my office, they could completely ignore my outreach if they want to. Hurts my feelings a little bit. No, just kidding. It's totally fine. They can request support and accommodations, or they can choose to go through an informal resolution process or a formal investigation process, of course, depending on the facts of the case. And like I said before, a survivor is never forced to participate in a process that they don't want to. I would say, at least here at Rollins, many students are choosing informal resolution options when they're available in their particular set of circumstances. So they don't have to go through a lengthy investigation or a hearing process, and they can still receive some accountability measures for the perpetrator. And so this focus on a more educational process, I think, speaks to that desire not to want to get a perpetrator in trouble. And really, when we think about Title IX or student conduct processes, those are designed to be educational in nature. Although the new Title IX regulations make the Title IX hearing kind of look maybe like a criminal trial, it actually is not a trial. So it's a student conduct hearing or a Title IX hearing where both parties have fair and equitable rights and equal access to information and the same rights and supports throughout the process. And it really is designed to be educational in nature. And even if someone is found responsible for a policy violation and sanctioned for punitive sanctions, they're always also going to receive educational sanctions along with that. Unless, of course, what they have done is something that would have them dismissed or permanently separated from the institution.
Thanks, Ari. I really like to break down those misconceptions about Title IX, because I know there's so much that people can actually gain from as far as resources when they do reach out. And I love that there's so many different options for survivors too. So that was like an important question. Actually, Julia, I wanted to ask you, because actually there was a question in the chat too about like consent education too, and soon we'll be opening up to Q&A in general, so stay tuned to that. But earlier we talked about teaching consent, and I hear a lot that education is the key to helping stop sexual violence. So do you think that there are any holes in violence prevention education, particularly on college campuses? And is there actually something we are missing or could be doing better as a whole society when it comes to education?
Emilie, you said we were getting short on time, so that I could talk about that all day. So I will reel myself in and maybe focus on just one or two things that I think we could be doing better. And something that I research and I'm really focused on is actually looking at perpetrators. So I'm really interested in how do we stop sexual assault from ever happening? We can't do that through interventions such as risk reduction programs, right, that teach women, for example, self-defense or how to protect their drinks. Those can help reduce rates of sexual assault, right, but they can't totally eliminate sexual assault. In order to totally eliminate sexual assault, we really have to focus on perpetrators and their actions and stopping perpetration before it even occurs. And to me, this really means focusing on things that Sarah touched on in the beginning. So focusing on things like hypermasculinity, things like rape myths that Kevin touched on a little bit, attitudes and beliefs that are related to sexual assault, as well as norms that we have about women and other high-risk populations that might be then intertwined with assaultive behavior. So I really think that we need to be thinking more about programming that is aimed at decreasing these types of attitudes and beliefs that are linked with sexual assault. This is not just for college campuses, but college campuses are kind of like an easy captive audience, right? Where we can do things like mass communication programs for the whole campus, but can go for the entire society, right? That we need to be thinking about these types of things. One just particular intervention that I'll highlight that kind of is a little more tangible than these vague, we need to change attitudes, beliefs, norms, is really focusing on peer norms. So we know that actually the majority of sexual assault is perpetrated by men, but the majority of men don't perpetrate sexual assault. The majority of men don't hold these types of rape myths and other beliefs. And yet those who perpetrate sexual assault research shows us, they think that their peers, that the majority of their peers do those types of behaviors and do think like them. So social norms programs are actually programs that work to correct these assumptions among those who are at risk of perpetrating. This has been shown to be effective with alcohol in particular. So many people think, oh, if I drink 8 drinks in a single setting 4 times a week or whatever it is, I think my peers are drinking at the same level. And when we do programming that actually shows them the typical student drinks X, Y, and Z number of drinks over a week, that then behavior change can result when they realize kind of that they have a different belief about what their peers think about. So we're starting to do some of this work in sexual assault in terms of correcting some of these misperceptions about what peers might think about women, what peers might think about how to treat people, about sexual violence, about rape myths, and all of those things. So I'll leave it at that, even though I could go on and on and on.
I appreciate that, Julia. I really appreciate that. I think that you're absolutely right. I love that there is more research kind of being done about this because, that is our goal, right? Is to end sexual violence. So I love that there's more research kind of being done about that. Jessica, I was really interested to talk a little bit about how COVID may have affected campus sexual assault in terms of trends or survivors coming forward. Do you think campuses and bars opening up will actually affect sexual assault trends now that things have kind of changed during the pandemic as well?
Yeah, this question really got me thinking. I hadn't even thought about how that's going to affect the amount of survivors that we have come forward. So with COVID, we've seen really adverse effects from what most other service providers have seen. Because our population, most of them have relocated with COVID, whether it's home or they're virtual, they're not all on campus as much as they used to have been. Our numbers have not spiked or gone up as we've seen normally, where we have an average number of cases. However, you raise a really good point about the reopening of establishments like clubs, bars, even sporting events. Tailgates are really big. We've got Cinco de Mayo coming up, where we have these kind of celebrations where alcohol is really prevalent, where we talked about the red zone already, where fall is coming, and that's normally where we see this spike in sexual assaults because of all the reasons Julia had brought up. And now we're going to be compiling the fact that these students maybe have not been able to go out like they've wanted to because COVID restrictions. Maybe people now are having more vaccines where they feel safer to go out and socialize. So we're having a lot more of all those vulnerable concerns that we brought up with the red zone, where now we might have more people involved socializing, where it's more vulnerable for a perpetrator to take advantage of that and have sexual assaults occur. So I would think that we are going to see a spike, that we are going to see a rise in it because of the timing of the year, and then also that COVID restrictions will probably be lightened up where we have more people able to socialize, where we really haven't seen that lately.
Yeah, I think there's going to be a lot of different factors kind of coming into play here. There's not just one, right? So it's, yeah, all of these things kind of compiling is kind of going to make the perfect storm maybe. And so, yeah, I was curious as to see what the trends were as far as victim services and UCF. So that's why it's really important to kind of share that, there's so many services out there and different ways that we can help prevent. And I saw that Sarah also just put, shared the reporting numbers have significantly declined, which is really interesting too. Kevin, as kind of like a final question, Julie was kind of talking about, mobilizing men and things like that. Do you think there are spaces on college campuses that actually encourage toxic masculinity? I just want to talk a little bit about that. So first off, what is toxic masculinity? How does it contribute to rape culture, and why is it so damaging to everyone regardless of gender identity? What effects can this have on male survivors, and what can universities do to help encourage healthy masculinity instead?
Yeah, this is definitely like a soapbox question for me, so I could go on. Yeah, toxic masculinity, you can define it in a lot of ways, but at its core, it's the innate idea that the patriarchy or traditional views of masculinity need to be upheld and placed above any ideas of femininity, queerness. All of that is lesser than what it means to be masculine. And there definitely are spaces that I think in a lot of ways subconsciously support this. I don't want to stereotype and say that all, most sports programs or most fraternity programs at schools are bad, but it is also the place, how many times a year do we see such and such fraternity get shut down because of multiple sexual assault allegations, or, this football player, basketball player, baseball player is off the team and now the team is under investigation because of, you don't see that in queer space. You typically don't see that from the chorus or the drama department. Because those are places where queerness and femininity is, at least in my experience, celebrated. So you see these in these places that, I think of sports rooms, and then we get quote unquote locker room talk. And what is that if not sexually derogatory language most of the time? And so it's just continuing this idea that it is okay to talk about women or, feminine presenting people in a way that is less than everybody else or less than masculinity. Like I like to talk all the time about how even homophobia is just a branch of sexism and toxic masculinity because it's a fear of the feminine. And if there's gay men that are embracing their femininity or acting more effeminate, then that's bad or threatening somehow to the patriarchy or to masculinity. And it damages straight men as well because it keeps them bound to a certain way of being. How many posts do I see where the punchline is like, at least I can tell my son or daughter that I love them every night, instead of this idea that like feelings are bad or crying is bad or being sensitive in some way is bad or weak. So it is really based in so much traditional ideas of masculinity, but as far as taking it back to college campuses, for me, it really ties into what I said earlier, like how are we ensuring that fraternities are getting some kind of training about what isn't acceptable as far as like what is sexual harassment, and it not, defining it in a way that they don't say, oh, that's just women being sensitive or that's just them, that's their issue. I'm just trying to give them a compliment. Like all those little isms that just keep happening that men excuse each other for this behavior. So it's some way of keeping them accountable, like having those sexual harassment classes, coaches calling out players for their bad behavior instead of being like, well, we'd punish him, but he's really our best quarterback, so we're just going to have to let this one slide. We make all these exceptions instead of keeping people accountable. And accountability doesn't have to be a bad thing, right? Like it doesn't have to be you're canceled, you can never play your sport again, you can never sing again, you can never be a business person. It's like, what can we do together to get some restorative justice for these bad, toxically masculine behaviors? And how can we ensure that you're better? And now you can help other people become better. That's what in a dream world, I would like to see in repairing the things that are toxically masculine.
Yeah, I love everything that you're saying. I think it's such an important part and piece to this conversation. And I appreciate that you say that it does harm, masculine people, obviously, but also kind of going back to kind of making sure that our, education is catered specifically to the people that we're talking to too, and like individualized as well. So I appreciate that. And with that, I know that I want to have some time. I know that we had some questions coming in from our lovely audience. So Roxane, if you want to read off some questions that you may have with the 20 minutes left we have.
Okay, we have, I believe, a total of 8 questions. So the first one is for anyone and everyone, all the panelists. How can we teach and reinforce the importance of consent when it comes to individuals with a disability, whether it be neurological or physical disability?
Try to tackle this one in a therapist sense.
Sure.
I'll start by saying that cognitive disabilities and physical disabilities aren't my forte when it comes to treating clients at Victim Service Center. But I do know that a lot of behavioral therapies are used for people who might have a cognitive disability or something that makes it harder to understand what boundaries are. And there are a lot of tools out there in terms of behavioral therapy for people with any kinds of disabilities that teach boundaries in a way that's more digestible. I guess my best example is my friend is a music therapist, and she works in early interventions with kids who are on the autism spectrum, but severely low functioning, they have it in a way that affects them pretty greatly. And she uses music and games at an early age to teach when it's okay to put your hands on other kids and how to make sure you're not harming them or putting them in their personal space. So there's, I don't know a lot of the stuff she does specifically, but there's a lot of interesting tips and tricks, play therapy, art therapy, to teach kids how to set appropriate boundaries, how to recognize when someone is not okay with what you're doing or doesn't want your physical touch, even if it means well. So there are a lot of those tools out there, and there are a lot of specialists for that kind of intervention.
That's such a great question. And I think that the CARD would be a great resource too, the Center for Autism and Related Disabilities. I know they do a lot of different education and things like that, because this is a very important topic, teaching boundaries for those who have an intellectual disability and things like that. So I would definitely reach out to CARD. But I hope that helped answer your question. That was a great question. Do we have another one?
Yes, this is for all, but I think it's specifically for Sarah based on your expertise. I know many survivors do not report to Title IX because there are many unfortunate stories of survivors being re-traumatized by the trial process, feeling as punished as their abusers with no contact orders, and being removed from classes or dorms, and overall not feeling prioritized by the Title IX office, especially considering the updates to Title IX last summer. What are you all doing to make sure students feel safe and trust your offices?
Yeah, it's a great question, and something that I think all Title IX coordinators and people who work in Title IX offices across the country are asking ourselves every day. The new regulations that were passed last summer are not survivor-centered, and certainly have swung the pendulum more on a respondent or the accused student side of things. And it's difficult. I can say from the Rollins perspective, and from many of my colleagues who I've worked with both in Florida and across the country, that we are doing everything we can within those regulations to still make our processes as survivor-centric and supportive as we possibly can within the confines of the law. And that can sometimes be difficult, especially with the live hearing and live questioning requirement that's in the new regulations. That's been a pretty tough one. I think for both parties, right, to think about sitting in a room with either the person who has accused you or the accused person and being questioned by the advisor of that person is not a comfortable situation to think about. What we do to combat some of those things is have very strict rules of decorum for what types of questions are allowed, what the demeanor of the parties participating in those hearings is, and we try to control that environment as much as we possibly can on the hearing front. Jess has been through a number of these hearings with survivors at UCF, I'm sure, as an advocate too, and has still seen, even with all the rules that we put in place and trying to be as caring and compassionate through the process as we can, sometimes people are still hurt and they're not satisfied with the outcome. And I just want you to know from the people working in Title IX that it kills us too when people aren't satisfied with the process. There are some things that we have to do to abide by the law and the rules of our policies and processes. We cannot be survivor advocates specifically because we do have to offer fair, equitable process for both parties who are involved. Title IX specifically protects people against sex-based discrimination, and that goes both ways. So fair, equitable processes are at the heart of what we're doing. For survivors, I think it's often hearing from someone else, and I think we touched on this a little bit earlier, right? I think maybe Kevin said if one trans person has a negative experience with an office and then they talk to their friends about it, does it make other trans people less likely to seek services from that office? I think that happens with Title IX too, that one person might not be satisfied with what happened and then they tell their friends about it and that spreads. And then often from the perspective of the college or university, we're unable to share our point of view about what happened. And so some of those misconceptions that maybe presented to other students or presented in the student newspaper might not be my perspective on what happened. But what I have to remember is that even if it is the survivor's perspective and I disagree, that is certainly how they felt and it is valid. And so then I need to go back and reflect how I have interacted with people and communicated with people and see if I can improve that. And it's just a constant growing and learning process. I mean, one thing that I would ask as a Title IX administrator is when students hear these concerning things or have questions or think like, well, that doesn't sound quite right, or I didn't think that is what the policy said, or I didn't think that's how you would be treated. Ask your Title IX coordinator, ask your victim advocate office, ask your student conduct office, ask your counselor, and have them ask a question anonymously so we can try to educate each other and shed some light on some of the misconceptions that we talked about in terms of Title IX. Someone who comes to my office is always going to be met with care, compassion, support, options, resources, accommodations. And the process is also not easy. It's not easy to report. It's not easy to go through an investigation. It's not easy to wait for the outcome of that investigation. And it's not easy to receive the outcome of the investigation, especially if it's not what you wanted to happen. And just know that I and my compatriots in this work hear that and care about that and wish sometimes that we had better answers, which I know is kind of like dissatisfying, but I would like students to know that I and my colleagues across the country care very deeply for our students' experiences and want to provide that care and support for all of our students.
I do appreciate, I love everything that you said, and I hope that that helped answer the question. Absolutely. And I love that you're able to kind of empower survivors too, is like that self-advocacy, right? Like, you know, checking in and being like, hey, this felt like this isn't how I expected it, or things like that, to kind of have the power to give some feedback essentially and share their concerns. I know that we're running short on time, but any other questions, Roxane, that you want to ask?
Yes. I'm trying to like really pick the ones that are like the most important. How much of early sexual education or lack thereof do you think perpetuates rape culture? And that's for everyone.
Yeah, I'll say something brief in case anyone else has an opinion on this, but so before I did this, I was a high school teacher for 3 years. And of course, in the state of Florida, it's abstinent only. And I also taught at a Catholic school. So like that on top of abstinence only was like, don't even think about it. And when I think of high school, I think that's when the conversation needs to happen specifically about sex and consent and what that looks like. But I think it needs to go earlier in very simple terms too, like consent to give someone a hug, you know, or consent to play a game with someone on a playground or shake their hand. It's really in all those small ways that is just reinforcing like you are allowed to have control over your body. And it's okay to decline a hug from aunt whoever because you don't feel like giving them a hug right.
Yeah.
Just having all those like built-in pieces that say like before you touch someone, make sure it's okay. Before you play a game with someone, make sure it's okay. Like just starting that narrative early instead of making it an expectation like, oh, go give so-and-so a hug. Like, I don't want to. Like, okay, respect your child's wishes. It's not taking away the idea that not hugging someone or not giving them a handshake is rude instead of just, okay, they don't want to. That's all it is.
Yeah, I totally agree, Kevin. I always bring that up, that teaching early on that you have a right to express boundaries and to your own safety and your own body early on is super important. Any other questions, Roxane?
Yes. Okay. So it's for anyone again. How do you approach intimacy, in parentheses, not just sexual intimacy, with someone who has sexual trauma and has trouble saying no because of that trauma? generally is constant consent checking annoying, I think is the question. Asking for consent, you have to ask for consent every step of the way, yes. But I think they're asking if asking it too much, can it get annoying?
I can talk about this kind of briefly from a consent point of view. And I think that sometimes when we think about consent, how I talked about before, that we need these tools, right, in our toolkit, and that it's not just one way of asking for consent, that consent can be sexy too, right? That it can be part of a sexual behavior, that it's not just, can I touch you here? Can I do this? That can seem a little bit robotic, right? And maybe would be annoying or whatever the concern is, but that actually having somebody ask you, does this feel good? Do you like this? Can I do that? Can be part of sex that can make it enjoyable. It doesn't have to be just with the goal of kind of making sure that I'm not harming, but it can actually be part of the goal of increasing enjoyment, right? So that we haven't really been taught about how, in part because of what Kevin was just talking about, when we start talking about sexuality, we often don't talk about healthy sexuality and what that looks like, and not just about how to avoid sexual assault, but actually about healthy sexuality, and that it's a full package. And I don't necessarily know the research on this, but I think that somebody asking you, is this okay, wouldn't be annoying to many people, right? That most people would like that. That would make them feel like somebody is concerned for them and is interested in their pleasure and their enjoyment. So that if you're worried about that, you can articulate those kind of concerns with your sexual partner, but they don't feel that you're annoying somebody. Because I don't, this is all personal, not research. I wouldn't see that as annoying, right? I don't know if other people have different opinions.
No, I love that, Julie. I think that you're absolutely right. That would definitely not be annoying. I love that you brought up that consent can actually be absolutely sexy. And while you were talking, I thought of, sometimes I bring up different ways you can ask for it. And I know that the question is kind of talking about if a survivor of sexual violence is your sexual partner. And yeah, there can be porous boundaries and things like that. And, with the power and control thing, one thing that you can do is kind of, as their sexual partner, ask what do you want to happen next? I think that is a really cool way to do it as well. Just to kind of piggyback off of that. Any other questions?
Okay, so there are two more questions. So the two questions, one of them is for Kevin and the other one is for both Emilie and Kevin. So the first one for Kevin is, what is being done to help non-binary and transgender survivors, and what can we do to help them as well?
That's a good question for non-binary transgender survivors. At least on the Victim Service Center end, so my role specifically is to work with the LGBTQ community and be plugged in just for survivors who do identify within that, so that there's someone who, has done a bit more research and specialization on the community as someone who identifies within that community, and just builds that extra sense of safety, rapport, they know a bit more about who I may be and where I'm coming from. And then making sure that the health resources, I think, are especially given. Orlando luckily has a really great network of resources, whether it's Spectrum Health, 26 Health, Bliss Health, the Center, the Zebra Coalition, making it known that Orlando is a safe space for people who are trans and non-binary, and that they are respected, and whether it's not just their pronouns being respected, but how they choose to dress and present themselves. I even recently spoke with someone at OPD and OCSO, the two big law enforcement agencies here, and we're working to get even more plugged in with them to offer more trainings on not re-traumatizing LGBTQ community members during the law enforcement and interview process. And I was I don't just want to do this to the already trained people, and it's not optional. I want to be in to the police academy every 3 months when you're training new people so that I can tell them. And they're like, yes, we can absolutely do that. So that's even something that we're developing as soon as this summer. So, kind of starting at the base, like with law enforcement, making sure that they have been told, and I was like, I want it documented that they had this training so that if they mess up, they need to do it again. I don't know if they'll do that, but I'm trying.
I love it. I love it.
Okay, our last question of the day is, what is VSC doing to create a more diverse environment that the BIPOC population will feel more welcome and understood, and what are the efforts to include them in the conversation?
That is such a great question. And I know that Kevin can also jump in on it too, as our VSC advocate as well. But I would say, first off, we took a hard look and we knew that a lot of different agencies were kind of coming out with these like anti-racism, statements and things like that. And so one of the things that we did was we actually reached out to Dr. Roshana Chappell, actually at UCF, who's phenomenal. And we wanted to do, just like Kevin was mentioning, training for law enforcement, we wanted to do training for ourselves to become more of an anti-racist agency, right? So that was one of the things, and we do those like quarterly, and we're actually working on making it part of the onboarding process. We're going to record it and then have it part of the training process. So that's one thing. We also are we're always looking to hire more diverse victim advocates to bring them into the conversation as well. We're always looking for that. I know that we're also looking to open up a new location in the Winter Garden area, specifically to target populations of people of color as well. Those are just some things that I know that we're doing at VSC. I don't know if you have anything you want to add to it, Kevin.
Yeah, those are the big ones. I was going to say too, we also have a group that I think it happens for 8 to 10 weeks at a time, but it's for specifically Black survivors, led by 2 Black therapists, so that they have, that community, that universality in the group to address some of the more specific intersectionalities of survivors of color. And so that's a big one that I know we started this past year as well. There was something else that I was thinking of, but we also, with the One Orlando Alliance, has a anti-racism committee to address LGBTQ POC intersectionality in the greater Orlando community with a bunch of nonprofits. So myself and one of our program directors take part in that as well, to kind of see where we can continue to grow and contribute as a community for that even more specific intersectionality.
Oh yeah, that's awesome. And I also want to mention that, there's so much work that needs to be done in general, and kind of everyone kind of needs to kind of look within ourselves and how we can be better anti-racist people. I also know that we're doing a book club actually at the VSC where we're reading how to be an anti-racist. So we're doing that too. But yeah, lots of work that needs to be done. Great question. Super important.
Okay, so this is coming to an end. I just wanted to let you all know that I did send resources that you can reach out to should you ever need it in the chat, along with the contact info of all the panelists in case you want to reach out to them. And then the slide on your screen is how to get involved with the VSC. April is Sexual Assault Awareness Month, so do take time to learn more about sexual violence. Denim Day is April 28th. Really quickly, Denim Day is there was a trial in Italy, and they claimed that the victim could not have been sexually assaulted because she was wearing jeans or skinny jeans, and that skinny jeans are hard to take off without consent. So ever since then, April 28th is a day that we wear jeans and we wear denim in order to fight victim blaming and fight for the rights of victims. So yeah, you can also volunteer, visit our website to learn more, and donate or choose VSC as your Amazon Smiles beneficiary. Thank you.
Yeah, I just want to thank everyone for being here today and our lovely panelists. I had such a great time talking about this really important issue. And I know the reason we put up this slide is because people might be listening and they're like, okay, I want to do something. I want to get involved. Well, you absolutely can. This is a great way to give back. I know we have a couple of other slides too, as far as, contact information I just want to share as well for our lovely panelists that Roxane has put in the chat, and then also just some resources too. But I just want to thank everyone once again for coming. And I hope that you all participate in Denim Day. And thank you once again.